All right, back on the Young Turks. Now we're going to talk to David Wessel. He's the author of In Fed We Trust, Ben Bernanke's War on the Great Panic. And this is a topic I'm very interested in. David, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. Now, let's start at the very beginning. So, what exactly is the Fed? Now, I know we've had this discussion on the show before, but I have to confess that I'm still a little confused about what part of it is private and what part of it is public.
The Federal Reserve was created by Congress in 1913 in response to a financial panic that had some bizarre similarities to the one that we have recently gone through. And its job is to control the amount of credit in the economy and to serve as a lender of last resort to banks when they get in trouble. In the way it's structured now, there's a 7-member board of governors in Washington. They're government employees. They're appointed by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate, 100% government. What's unusual is that there are also 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread throughout the country. They are technically owned by the commercial banks in their districts, although they don't make any money at that. And the banks in the districts elect 6 of the 9 directors of each of these Federal Reserve banks. And the idea was to make it a little bit independent of politicians, but still be part of the government. It's very unusual. It's kind of a historical anomaly, and it's now up for review because of all that we've seen in the past 2 years.
All right, so the guys on the Fed, including Bernanke, are government officials, though.
Government officials, 100%, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, just like a member of the Supreme Court or the Secretary of Transportation.
Okay, but the guys at the regional banks, like Geithner was when he was the head of the New York Fed, they're private.
They're technically private institutions created by the government. The presidents of those regional Fed banks are appointed by private sector directors in their districts, subject to the approval of the government employees in Washington.
All right, so the government has to approve them, but the private banks choose them.
Correct.
Okay, now, so we've got a public-private mix. Now, here comes the critical question. Where do they get all the magic money?
It's very hard to understand, but essentially the Fed is a giant printing press. They can create money and they can destroy it. It used to be that they would actually do it with dollar bills, trading dollar bills for government securities. Now they do it electronically. When this crisis started, the Fed had $800 billion of securities and loans on its books. Today they have $2 trillion worth. They created it themselves. That's the magic of central banking.
All right, now
nice work if you can get it.
Yeah, it's not bad. Can I get a couple billion off them? They won't miss it. No, but
you
seriously,
have to be too big to fail to get a loan.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I'm getting there, but in all seriousness here, how do they? What authority do they have to create? In what you just said here, going from $800 billion to $2 trillion, they just created $1.2 trillion. What authority do they have for that?
The Congress, under the Constitution, the Congress has the right to coin money and regulate it. They have delegated that power to the Federal Reserve. And so the Federal Reserve can, in normal times and abnormal times, go into the markets and put cash into the markets and get government securities in return, and when it wants to take credit out of the economy, it does the reverse. It sells government securities from a portfolio and takes credit out. And how do you know this is happening? You see the interest rates they control go up and down. Interest rates are the price of money. When the Fed is putting money in, interest rates go down, and they take money out, vice versa.
Okay, but is that how they do it? You know, if it's just a matter of bringing the interest rates up and down, I get it, and I'm not that shocked by it. But if it's a matter of creating money, when did Congress give them that authority? Was that back in 1913?
Yep, back in 1913.
And is it limitless? Can they say, hey, you know what, we feel like creating $10 trillion now?
One of the reasons that this episode has been so upsetting to a lot of politicians is they realize that it basically is limitless. Now, of course, the Congress could any day change the law and prevent the Fed from doing stuff. But at this point, we give the Fed the power to create money, the Congress does, and the Fed decides how much money they want to create. If they create too much money, we get inflation. If they don't create enough money, we don't have enough credit in the economy, and we have a really bad recession.
Now, we keep talking about creating money, and that's what's, I think, throwing a lot of people for a loop. Because normally the way government used to work back in the day is you would collect taxes, so that would be your revenue, and you got it from somebody. You got it from Joe and Sally and Bob, and you collected that money together, and then you spent that money, right? And that's how the money was created. Now, how the Fed is not getting it from revenue, so how are they creating it?
The Fed works through the banking system, and it has a portfolio of government securities which it can buy and sell. When it buys securities, it prints money, literally prints money, and that puts money into the system that then the banks can lend out. If all a bank had on its books was government securities and you came for a loan, it wouldn't have any cash to give you. So it gets, in part, its cash from the amount of reserves that the Fed creates. And this is not unusual. This is all central banks all over the world work this way. What's unusual about this episode is how much money the Fed created in a hurry in order to prevent us from falling into another Great Depression. What Bernanke learned from his study of the Great Depression is the Fed didn't create enough money in the 20s and 30s, and we had the horrible economy. He was trying to do the opposite this time around, and so far he seems to have succeeded.
We're talking to David Wessel. He is the author of In Fed We Trust. Now, before we get to what happened in this specific instance, just one last thing. Now, the reason the Fed doesn't normally create $1 trillion and, for example, give it to the American government and all of a sudden your deficit is gone is because that's going to cause inflation. It's going to devalue the dollar, I take it, and cause other economic problems.
Correct.
And that's why they don't want to do it on a regular basis.
Correct.
So now we get to what happened today or over this period of time here. Now, they seem to have tremendous power, as we talked about there. When they decide to create this money, the issue I have is where does it go? Okay, so we just talked about where it came from, which is they pressed a couple of buttons on a computer, but for reasons that I think are somewhat logical, and at least I understand that motivation. But where does the money go?
The Fed operates usually through the banking system, and when the markets are functioning normally, they do all this through the banks in a set of banks that they deal with, and these banks spread the money throughout the system. One problem that the Fed encountered this time that the usual channels were clogged. So they are creating money in all sorts of unusual ways. In this crisis, they in fact lent money to industrial corporations that gave them IOUs in return. They went into the market and they bought mortgages and mortgage-backed securities in order to get money into that market, and they are buying Treasury bills on the open market. They are trying to find other ways to get credit into the economy because the usual channels, the banks, were clogged, and the money would go into the banks, and the banks would hold on to it and not lend it. So they're looking for other ways to get credit into the economy.
So are they giving it to Citigroup at all, or they're not giving it to Citigroup?
They have lent money to Citigroup. They have lent money to all the big banks, and they get collateral in return. Now, what happened in this episode was about the fall of 2008, Bernanke said, enough. We can't keep creating enough money to keep the system going. He and Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson went to Congress, and they got $700 billion, as you put it, the old-fashioned way. They didn't raise it in taxes. They borrowed money on the market, a lot of it from foreigners like the Chinese, and that money they invested in Citibank and Bank of America and the other banks to keep them from going under.
All right, so they take the money that they got from TARP to give to the city banks, et cetera. I get that money. The extra money that they get, so if you don't return the TARP money, that adds to our deficit, okay? And that's part of the normal budgetary process.
Correct.
What if Citibank doesn't return the other kind of money that the Fed created and loan to them?
The Fed is not supposed to lend money to any bank unless it gets some piece of property to hold on to, a bond, a security, something called collateral. And if the Citibank can't pay it back, the Fed is supposed to take that collateral and then it can sell it and make itself whole. So the Fed is not supposed to lend money unless it thinks it can get it back. Now, in this instance, they kind of stretched the law a little bit, and they bought some stuff in the Bear Stearns rescue and in the AIG rescue that probably isn't going to be worth as much as they paid for it. They'll take a loss. When the Fed turns a profit, as it usually does, it gives the profit after paying its expenses over to the Treasury. They will give less money over to the Treasury if they lose money on these big deals.
Okay, so let's say with the extra $1.2 trillion, they lost $200 billion of it. Okay,
it's not very unlikely, but let's say they did.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's say they did. Where does that money get taken? Does that get taken out of the Treasury? How does that work?
That is money that the Fed would have given the Treasury that it doesn't. So it would, in effect, make the deficit bigger.
it would make the deficit bigger.
Yes, because the Fed takes the money it has left over at the end of the year and gives it to the Treasury. If the Fed has a big loss, it'll have less money to give to the Treasury, gives less money to the Treasury, then the deficit's bigger.
All right, David, why are they not telling us where they're putting the money? Because when they come in front of Congress, and people like Congressman Grayson question them on this, and Ron Paul, and so both sides of the aisle, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't tell you where we put the money.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. They have said, they have disclosed quite a bit about who they've lent money to through these extraordinary programs. You can go online and see how much money they lent to Bear Stearns and what kind of security they got in exchange, and similarly with the other big banks. The one thing they won't disclose is, in the ordinary course of business, if a bank says to the Fed, look, we got a problem here. We have a lot of loans, and the loans are good, but we have a lot of depositors, and they want their money right away. And we don't have the money to give it to them right away, and we can't get the loan money back right away, but we think the people are good for it. Then the Fed lends the money to tide them over. It's called the lender of last resort function. And the Fed's argument is, if we put out a list of all the banks that came and borrowed from us directly at a pinch like that, that would create more panic and more people would take money out of the bank, and it would create a run on the bank. So that's the information that they're saying we can't give you the list. But the Bear Stearns, AIG, Citibank, and the really extraordinary stuff in the tens of billions of dollars, that they do disclose. But they're up against it now because people are suspicious of them. Americans have always been suspicious about concentrations of financial power. They were stunned to see how much power the Fed had, and so the Fed puts out more information, and people say it's not enough. They want more because they don't really trust Bernanke, and they don't trust the Fed, and that's a huge problem for the institution.
David, real quick here as we run short on time, is there any chance that if we had another cataclysmic collapse, the AIG black hole, and then let's say Goldman turns into a black hole, that at some point the Fed collapses?
I think it's extremely unlikely. That would be saying that the U.S. government was bankrupt. And so far, the U.S. government has shown that in a crisis, people all around the world who have money would rather lend money to the U.S. government than to anybody else. So I think it's unlikely that we'll hit that black hole. Very unlikely.
All right. There's so much more to this, and I'd love to have you back on to talk more about it.
I'd be happy to do that.
But the book is called In Fed We Trust, Ben Bernanke's War on the Great Panic. We'll put it up on theyoungturks.com in our library, and you can get it from there. David Wessel, thank you so much for joining us on The Young Turks.
You're welcome.